Hello listeners, and welcome to Plugged In, the energy news podcast from Montel, where we bring you the latest news, issues and changes happening in the energy sector. It's that time of year again. We're at the Energy Trade Fair eWorld in Germany, where some 30,000 people across Europe's energy sector have gathered. It's a lively, upbeat atmosphere inside the four walls of the Essen Messe, as delegates meet, cut deals, talk and collaborate. But outside, beyond the city, beyond the continent, the geopolitical events that have set 2026 off to a turbulent start rumble on, as tensions between Iran and the US mount and Russia launches its latest wave of attacks on Ukraine's power system. In this episode, I sit down with a panel of experts here at eWorld to discuss the outlook for Europe's supply and demand as we trundle through 2026 and why, if and when peace finally comes to Ukraine, it will have a power grid that will be the envy of Europe. But first, I'm pleased to be joined by Montel's investigative reporter, Mai Rosen. A warm welcome and debut to the Plugged In podcast, Mai.
Thank you very much, Richard. Happy to be here.
You've been an investigative reporter for many, many years. How would you assess the current geopolitical situation, especially with regard to global energy markets?
Well, I think we're living in unprecedented times. You know, we all kind of woke up 4 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine and realized that this enormous dependence we have on each other for energy is also a vulnerability that can be weaponized by hostile dictators, by hostile countries. And we woke up to that reality in a pretty rude way, and we're now living in a world post that realization where, you know, we have to be wary about the kinds of dependencies that we're building, with the United States behaving less like an ally than it's ever been, with Donald Trump threatening to take over Greenland, with the kind of forced removal of Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro. We're living in a world where the rules seem to not apply, and our energy system is incredibly interconnected. And what that means is that it's being pressure tested in a way where all these vulnerabilities are being exposed on where we rely on each other, on where the money from these commodities being traded is funding hostile dictators or, you know, countries with other geopolitical interests. So all of this is kind of being exposed, but at the same time, we're also learning about how flexible the energy system can be. And I think that was a big surprise for many people. You know, if you had told most people who work in the energy world 5 years ago that Germany would be, you know, free of Russian gas, I think they would have laughed in your face. So we are also, you know, in times that it feels like change is accelerated. And we have to remain kind of flexible and independent as much as we can.
So, I mean, there are lots of... It was good you pointed out some bright spots, but there are lots of dark clouds on the horizon. What are the biggest concerns?
Well, I think one major concern is that, you know, we learned, as I said, that, you know, having a energy dependence on a single nation, a single government is a dangerous place to be. And I do fear that Europe is repeating mistakes of the past by promising Donald Trump that they will buy enormous amounts of American LNG, more than they're even able to consume. I think that the risk of creating those kinds of dependencies, again, are very high. I also think that underlying all of this is an accelerating climate crisis. And that poses enormous difficulties as well. And it is really important that we safeguard Europe's commitment to the rollout of renewable energy, even in the face of, big oversupply of LNG, an LNG supply glut, and the push by the United States to get Europe to consume more and more American gas. And I think that there's this, you know, real risk also of just more conflict breaking out in the Middle East. We see this tension with Iran, with Venezuela, with China and Russia. There's just increasing tension, and I think we're in this place of very high risk for more breakout of conflict, and that obviously has implications for energy systems, and even the sale of energy has implications for the funding of these different conflicts and war around the world. So that's another risk that's on the horizon, and one that I hope is not realized.
Yeah, absolutely. I share that sentiment entirely, Mai. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Let's hear now from our panel of experts and what they believe to be Europe's greatest impending challenges for its energy sector. I'm pleased to be joined by three good friends of the podcast. Henning Gloystein, Managing Director of Energy and Resources at Eurasia Group. A warm welcome to you, Henning.
Thank you very much. Great to be back.
Hans Koenig, Managing Director of Aurora Energy Research. A warm welcome to you. Welcome back,
Great to be
Hans.
back.
And of course, Tobias Federico, Chief Analyst at Montel. Welcome, all of you. Now, we've got a lot to talk about, a lot to squeeze in 30 minutes. Tobias, I'd like to start with you, if I may. We spoke at the beginning of January, just after Trump's attack on Venezuela and the rest of his presidents, and the impact this was going to have on oil and gas markets. What's changed since then, do you think? And how have global markets fared over the last month?
Actually, what's quite interesting, I think global market really moved back to fundamentals more, as we had a quite huge dominance of a cold wave all over Europe when it comes to natural gas. Oil was quite calm, and even natural gas prices came down recently compared to what we had in February. So we are in a situation where, first of all, we see a certain oversupply on the natural gas side in the next years coming. So that the impact of that, what has happened in January when we made our beginning of the year podcast, was much lesser than expected. So the market is not super nervous about, let's say, a volume risk in that sense. Might be a bit nervous from the what else could happen thing. So the quite erratic behavior of Trump. But in the end, the situation has calmed down a bit or changed back to fundamentals, I would say.
Okay, so is a combination maybe of the weather and geopolitics here that seems to be driving here?
If you would ask me, I would say 80-20, 80% fundamental drivers, 20%.
Exactly. And normally, sometimes over the weekend, we seem to be getting some big announcements. Hans, what's your view here? What do you see as the major drivers at the moment?
Well, basically, I agree with Tobias, and I find it really remarkable that I mean, if you had told me half a year ago that in early 26 we're in a world where the U.S. Kidnapped the president of the country with the largest oil reserves globally, we might be debating a U.S. attack on Iran. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is still going on, and nervousness in oil and gas and all these kind of things is pretty low. I would have been very surprised, frankly, and I think what this might be a reflection of is that two things fundamentally. On the supply side, I think we brought a lot of new capacities online already, and there's much more coming in the years to come. So we're rather heading for a market that's long in oil and gas, and you see that also in the reaction of the American shale drillers on the oil and gas side to Venezuelan exports being announced to come back to the world market. I mean, they're not happy about this at all, right? Because it's bad for prices rather than good for prices. On the other hand, of course, the world economy isn't performing super strongly in China, in Europe, and so on. So also the demand side is more subdued than what we might have expected a year or two ago. And then those taken together give you a quite relaxed supply-demand balance and this relaxed overall market despite this geopolitical turmoil.
And how do you see what's happening in the Middle East? You mentioned Iran. If I'd said to you 6 or 8 months ago, even at eWorld last year, and said, Hans, exactly the scenarios that you've just highlighted, and said markets hardly reacted, what would your reaction have been then? I mean, it's hardly fathomable.
That's the thing. I would have been surprised, frankly. And the only way I can explain it is that fundamentally the market is quite relaxed if you look at the quantities, and if we were in a tighter world, there would have been a much bigger reaction, both to the cold spell and to the threat of an American attack on Iran.
So it's because we're well supplied. What's your take, Henning?
Yeah. So before we totally agree on absolutely everything, which we do, but there's a few things you can hold. So if you start with oil, you can see, and we actually already saw that mid last year, when the Strait of Hormuz really was at risk of being shut down. That's when Brent moved to $80 per barrel. Now, nobody really expects the Straits to fully shut down. Venezuela, yeah, there's been a few ruptures, but Vitol is already trading its oil, so there's actually not been a disruption, and that's why we haven't gone that much higher on Brent prices. And then, of course, got the fundamentals of an oversupplied market. However, I think for Europe, 2026 actually looks quite tight. When we just, at Eurasia Group, we revised our forecast that initially said that 2026 would already be quite oversupplied in terms of natural gas coming in from the LNG side and because of the global oil market situation. And while that is still our view, especially for 2027 this year, I think it's become quite tight because, of course, it has been cold for quite a long time. The situation in Ukraine really is brutal. And yeah, I was there at the start of the bombing campaign in Kyiv in November, and it's still ongoing. I mean, I'm out and I'm happy we're here, but they're freezing. There's no power, and that means that the Ukraine has to be supplied with electricity and natural gas via the European Union, so that's tighter. And then, I mean, this is probably good news, but on the demand side, there's actually real movement now. I mean, if you look at the German official data that was released last week, the fabricated metals consumption in Germany in the last 2 months of 2025 was 30% higher than the Euros. And processed metals is energy-intensive stuff, and you can see that in CO2 permit demand. The electricity consumption from the heavy industry is really going up now because the stuff that we were starting to talk about on this podcast exactly a year ago, so the German spending program has turned from a plan into actual spending. Because if you look at the order books of the heavy industry, like it down the road of Rheinmetall and all those dogs, they've really jumped. And the only sector that's not doing well there is the auto sector. They're still a bit screwed. But on the demand side of heavy industry, you're really seeing a demand side. And that's why we think that's tightening up as well. And then lastly, on the LNG front, I suspect, this is non-knowledge, but I suspect that some of the LNG additions that have been announced for this year will be delayed because the LNG sector globally has a terrible track record of punctuality. Okay. And so I reckon this is still quite tight. Not a supply risk. Yeah. So it's a bit tight. And of course, the German storages are below 30% now. It's still cold.
But so there's a little bit of disagreement between you and us. Yeah, a little minor differences maybe. Then maybe Hans will come back to that. But when you're saying, this rise in demand from German industry, is that also because you're starting to see maybe an increase in preparedness for tensions in terms of military tensions?
Yeah, I mean, it's the defense budget's gone up. The infrastructure spending is going up. Deutsche Bahn has a defense budget of a mid-sized nation. I mean, they're making tracks, not tanks, but it's like there is a lot of spending going on into these energy-intensive industries. They're making ammunition, submarines, airplanes, missile defense system, and building tracks. So, and I think that will continue. And it's not just Germany. Poland has a bigger per capita infrastructure budget for this year than Germany. And the Netherlands, they're spending a lot as well. So the whole sort of Baltic and North Sea coast, we think industrially looks quite bullish at the moment.
Hans, I see you're nodding your head. Do you agree with that view?
Yeah. I don't think there's actually a big disagreement in the sense that I think given my point was rather given where we stand with the storages below 30%, I think prices are remarkably low. If we'd seen the current storage levels 2 or 3 years ago, I think we would have seen much higher prices than what we're seeing now. And that is then more to do with a relatively well supplied market overall. But of course, we're going to have a challenge refilling the German gas storages over the summer, right? Just getting physically enough in will be a massive task. And of course, also the market is not necessarily sending the right signals, right? Because the summer winter spread is inverted, could remain inverted if there's so much demand in the summer. And then there was the question, what does the regulator do to actually enforce a filling? Because we need the gas storages to be relatively well filled in the winter.
But I'd like to move on to a point that you raised, Henning, and ask you, Tobias, about it. The Straits of Hormuz. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this. I mean, has that concern eased now in terms of what's happening the past few weeks, that they could be closed off, or is there still a real possibility?
I would say there's nothing which is not a real possibility, honestly, in the world now with the geopolitical chaos, I would say. But the discussion about the Strait of Hormuz right now, it's quite interesting because we are mostly, back in the years we have been focused due to oil. Now we are focused on that due to natural gas and LNG transport, as Qatar is one of the biggest suppliers for Europe. I think it's the second one or first one, I'm not sure if it's US or Qatar. But nevertheless, the thing is, if that street would be closed, you will really have a supply risk. If it's the situation is really, it's a big question who could close it. Would the US close it? No. Would Iran close it? Yes, maybe. But I think their cooperation with Qatar is too high that it's quite likely that it's going to be closed. So I think it will not be closed. And so therefore it's always a threat somehow if there are somehow tensions. But in the end, I'm very, very sure that we will not have a supply risk.
Okay, I'm with you with that. What's your take, Henning?
Yeah, I actually during the last summer I heard quite a big swinging oil trader. He was just saying, no, the spice must flow. And the reason is, I mean, the United States has a full aircraft carrier fleet in the Strait of Hormuz now. They will bomb it open if they have to. So our view is actually that Iran, if they try, that they won't manage it. They can blow up a tank or two, but the US and its allies have enough naval capacity to escort tankers through there. So you'd have the risk of maybe one or two tankers, and the headlines and the images of them burning, but the crude oil supply would actually still be maintained. All that said, we actually have a call still, despite the talks over the last couple of days between the US and Iran in Oman, that the US will strike before April 30th. Now, until last week, our view was that they were imminent, these strikes, and that we've now pushed towards the latter end of this outlook. But our view is still that the United States wants to interfere. And I mean, they've got more than 45,000 highly trained and well-equipped soldiers there. And if they don't do anything with them, that's a huge waste of money.
For sure. But that risks a regional escalation and military conflict which could have wide-ranging impact. Anything, Hans?
Absolutely, and just to add to the point on not closing the Strait of Hormuz, I think the reason Iran is not doing it is because if the US aren't yet set or weren't yet set on intervening in Iran, that would very likely trigger that intervention, right? And over the past couple of months, the Iranian regime has been rather trying to de-escalate with the Americans, and had rather been trying to keep them away from moving in, because looking at the Venezuelan example, that's probably not something that wouldn't be something that would end terribly well for you. Yes, but of course, if the U.S. intervenes, and to be very open here, this is above my pay grade. I think this is the heading is much better position to comment there. But of course, then to some extent, all bets are off, and this could be a very short surgical thing where the Iranian leadership gets decapitated, and there's no wider regional escalation. It could also be just the opposite, right? And that if the surgical strike doesn't work and we go into a protracted conflict in the region. And of course, the even bigger question is then what, even assuming the intervention is successful, what does that mean for the relationships of all the other countries in the region among each other? Because if you take Qatar, if you take the Emirates, if you take the various other players in the world, they are not naturally friends with each other. They're getting along right now because they have a common enemy, and it's kind of like everyone can kind of agree that the Iranians are a threat, and we should kind of play nice. But if they are gone, I think we would see a whole set of additional conflicts breaking out between the various Arab countries.
And that's of course a quite major danger here, and could have far-reaching consequences. Tobias, I want to move to maybe a sort of a colder part of the world, Greenland. Now, Trump seems to have backed off with Greenland slightly after announcing he won't be taking it by force. I've seen comments being made today on Tuesday by the President Macron saying it's not off the table. What's your view?
Well, I think it will never be really off the table. If you take a view on the globe, and usually, or if we see a map, we usually see two-dimensional maps. But when you have a globe and you rotate it, you see how close the distance between US/Canada and Russia's slash China is over the Arctic. And back in the days, we said there will never be a war about the Arctic, but over the Arctic. And Greenland plays a crucial role. First of all, Trump calls it the Golden Dome, a protection shield against a potential attack from Russia, what we also had back in the days in the Cold Wars, first. But secondly, if you look then, and now I'm speaking about the Arctic, who has access to the Arctic shelf? And what nations have access to this? The US only has a tiny little fraction of that. Russia, of course, quite big. But then we have Norway, we have Denmark/Greenland, and we have Canada, which are all having a major share in that potential resource-rich area, which unfortunately with the climate change can be utilized much, much more. So I think the discussion around Greenland or generally around the Arctic will not be over. Yeah, but it's not that potentially by force taking it.
Henning, your view on Greenland? Is it a red herring, or is there a real threat that could be taken over by the US?
And I mean, Trump, we know, wants Greenland, and his main reason isn't what's often touted, the mineral reserves. But the main thing is he wants to see. I mean, he said it. He wants to be the first US president in a century expands US territory. And then you have part of his government that has this hemisphere thinking. It's in the national security strategy, it's in the national defense strategy, which was just released 2 weeks ago, where they see the Americas as their hemisphere. And this is, I mean, Venezuela is a play in this. The Canada demands are a play in this. Panama threats are a play in this. We actually think that Trump at some point will try to have a go at Panama as well. He said, I mean, he says to his cabinet, we built the canal, it's ours. So I think that's important to keep in mind there. And
that's the Donroe Doctrine.
It is, yeah, exactly, yeah. And we have to accept that. Well, no, we don't have to accept it, but we have to acknowledge that the U.S. has and Trump has that desire. And so I totally agree with Macron saying that this isn't over. The only thing that seems to be over is on the trying to send soldiers there. So we know during Davos, basically on his way to Davos, Trump changed his mind because there was a host of factors that happened that prevented it from him. So there was a couple of Republican senators who said, if you do this, we will switch sides. And the Democrats need 20 Republican senators to move over, and then they can start impeachment programs again. So he's a bit worried about that. Wall Street pulled him and said the Treasury market is a bit wobbly here. The debasement trade is a bit of a fears, and that's why Scott Bessent at Davos went all out and said all these fake news about selling the dollars is nonsense, but there was a risk. And the Pentagon gave him a call and said there's actually a risk that if you order a military attack on a NATO ally, that significant parts of the US armed forces refuse order. And so and then the Europeans said no as well. How rude of us.
Yeah, exactly. So that was maybe why the plane was late landing very well. That he had all these phone calls to deal with. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But so if it were to happen, it's not off the table. If it were to happen, that's the final straw for that transatlantic alliance, is it not?
So I actually, I'm afraid I normally try and be optimistic about things, but on this one, we've talked to quite a lot of European defense ministries recently. They all said we can't assume Article 5 to be live at this time, unfortunately. And no one says it's dead because you don't want to call it dead yet, but you have to assume it. So you can hope that you're wrong and that the Americans will still come and support a European ally, but you must assume that it's not functioning.
But that plays into Putin's hands, does it not? Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely, and it's all a matter of timing, right? So I think the estimates of the German armed forces and military intelligence are that Russia could be ready to launch another invasion after the current one in 2028 or 2029, and now it's basically a race against the time for Europe to get ready for that, to counter that in some way without the Americans, because I completely agree with Henning. We can no longer rely on Article 5 being fulfilled, and even if there's a new American government, there will be substantial structural pressures in America to reduce the involvement in Europe, right? So Europe will have to learn to stand on its own feet, and that, I think, is going to require a bunch of decisions which we're not yet ready to make, right? So we're now rearming conventionally in Europe. An early discussion about some kind of nuclear deterrent sharing in Europe is starting, but if you look at what the actual deterrents look like, the Americans basically, the British have basically American bombs, and there's good reason to believe that the Americans could prevent the Brits from using them if they wanted to. The French have an extremely limited arsenal anyway. Governing nukes at a European level is probably a nightmare. So I just to put one out there, I do think we need a discussion about a German nuclear deterrent.
Mhm. Very, very interesting. I mean, keeping with the subject of Russia, and I'd like to move on to the Ukraine here. We're approaching the 4-year anniversary. So what have we learnt really, Tobias, from the war over the last 4 years?
Well,
in terms of energy supply in particular.
That's because I think we've learned a lot, as it's my typical in wars. I mean, in energy supply, what we've learned in the last 4 years was that we in Europe can move quite quickly if we want to. We really changed our supply from a pipeline driven towards LNG focused, not mostly driven. Sometimes it's price driven. I think still in our mind, the discussion we had before regarding the gas storage levels in Germany, we still are very limited and focused on the gas storage, which is one part of the equation, but still on that same supply side, we still have LNG. So we can adapt. The adaptation was paid at a very high price, literally, so very high gas prices and then power prices and a very high inflation rate. And that plays into role, but now we are moving completely backward in the sense of we are going towards a situation of an oversupply in natural gas. So that is one thing. What we should have learned, what we haven't learned yet, is that we should diversify our energy sources. And we just changed from one dictator to a wannabe dictator, which is then from the US. And that is something we haven't really learned to really diversify ourselves. So that is a bit of a pity. And we are always speaking about we need to become more resilient. But actually, I don't see it. We have tendencies right now, and we are not there yet. And you mentioned the time pressure of a potential military invasion up to 28, 29. That time frame is too short to really get resilience, as we are mostly focused in our economic well-being in general, rather than a military economy like Russia is. So I think the focus right now is, okay, we coped it more or less, but we are not prepared for the next potential thing coming up. Military-wise, but also energy-wise.
But also, you've got a situation of hybrid war as well, actually ongoing, pretty much since 2014, we've had a massive increase. The last, of course, was the Berlin outage. And maybe you could say, was that a situation of the hybrid war? Could you say that?
Well, it's hard to say. We don't really know, because the group who made it, the so-called Vulcan group, we don't know who they are. They're still looking for it. And I think they are paying €1 million for any tip. It was quite a lot, honestly.
So if any listeners know something, that's a good money to debate.
We'll pass it on, exactly.
Yeah, that will pass it on. Now, the thing is really, I think when it comes to hybrid warfare, Russia is our master in that sense. They really know how to do it. But that's an old way which already came from the Soviet times, playing with insecurity, with kinetic attacks. And the Berlin played a bit into that role. If it was really Russia-driven or it was a far left-wing group, that is one thing. But at least playing with the public opinion, the Russians are really having that war already going on. And in some parts we see when we look into rail tracks in Poland, for example, or the disruption of communication of the German railway 1.5 years ago. These are all signs that this hybrid warfare is going on in general, energy specific. We have all these fishing research vessels in the Baltic Sea, always around wind farms. That's quite interesting, or at least undersea cables. So we are at war, at a hybrid war.
I think you've got we've seen attacks on offshore wind farms, hybrid attacks. We've seen a Norwegian reservoir dam being emptied when the valve was emptied. So these are incidents that are out there. But a clear strategy as well from Russia, going right back to Soviet times, has been bombarding, annihilating the energy energy systems, whether it be power plants, whether it be substations, whether it be power lines or grids, Henning. You were back there, you mentioned you were back there in November. Can you describe for us what about some of the experience, what you saw, what you experienced?
Yeah, it's good that you bring that up because I actually think it's somewhat, I mean, it's in the media now quite heavily, but it's not wide enough understood what the Russians have done here beyond the actual invasion itself. I don't think it's ever happened that a nation actively takes out the entire civil energy infrastructure of another nation. I don't think that's actually happened ever. And that's what they've done. They've taken out 40 thermal power stations, all the compressor stations, all the grids. They've attacked the gas storage sites and the gas production site. So it's a systematic attack. And I mean, I was there right at the start. So it was the last week of decent weather in Kyiv. And it was quite pleasant. And at the first 3 days, everything was fine. Shops are open. Kids are going to school. It's like almost normal. Apart from there was quite a lot of air raids at the time because they were starting that wave. And now, I mean, we have an analyst in Kyiv. They have no fresh water, no heating, no electricity for up to 20 hours a day. And it is really cold there. And so it's fixing that will take years. There's a positive story about it as well. Ukraine, we know this, they will build the most modern grid possibly in the world because they have to start from scratch. So it'll be a decentralized, super modern power grid, very smart. And so I think that's going to be something to watch. It's going to be a huge business opportunity for all the companies that are here. But we need peace first, and we don't have that at this stage. And I think maybe as a last thought on this, if you look at this take a step back on a European level, Europe is under siege. And we have that as a top risk for this year, but it's under siege from our eastern border because of the ongoing Russian invasion and the hybrid warfare that we were just discussing. It is now under siege from the United States, again, in that national security document, in the national defense strategy. Europe is picked out as a target, the European Union, and to support the patriotic parties of Europe, which weaken the EU. That is official US policy now, and they threaten, Danish territory. You can see that in the rise of the populist anti-European parties across Europe that are supported by Russia and the United States now. So we're being picked up by by Russia, by the United States. The Chinese are also taking advantage of this because we're an economic competitor for them. So we're almost like the third world here now because we've got the two major superpowers. They're fighting for dominance globally, and then you've got the Russians. So everyone's picking on Europe at the moment. And it's a tough place, and this resilience thing is important there.
So that's what I'd like to sort of end on, if you like. We have to, unfortunately, bring this to a close. But if I can say, it's hard to sort of end on a note of optimism, I think, in what we're talking about here. But if we can say, if you had a wish list for politicians, either at the national or EU level, in terms of increasing resilience, preparedness for what we're going to face in the years to come, what would that be, Hans?
So it's a long one, but I'm just going to focus on one thing, and that is actually getting Ukraine closely involved in Europe. And with that, I mean the EU. And of course, there's challenges on like rule of law and anti-corruption and so forth, which we shouldn't gloss over. But I think basically Ukraine is currently experiencing the future of warfare and the future of conflict. Of course, in a horrible way, like the attacks on the power grid, they're war crimes. Let's call them what they are. Yeah. But they are learning how to deal with this in a pace which no Western European country would be prepared for right now. And also that's not even mentioning cyber attacks. That's not even mentioning drone warfare, where they are orders of magnitude better than anyone in Western Europe. So I think we really need to learn very closely from Ukraine to get up to their standards about modern defense and modern warfare,
and also a modern energy system potentially.
And modern,
yeah. Tobias,
maybe to phrase it this way: don't be naive. I mean, we very often think very naive, or that will be good. America is our friend. Russia was our friend. They always supplied us with gas. And I mean, we should strongly see us as an individual country, nation, continent. We should stand our ground. And despite what they are telling us of stories, just don't be naive. Take the fundamental data, diversify, become more resilient, and have a bit more courage in investing into new things.
Absolutely. I think finally, the word is yours.
The electrification of stuff needs to be accelerated here. It helps reduce import dependence. China is making a very good show of it, how fast they're electrifying everything, transport, industry, heating, power, obviously. So I think that's a priority, and that means we need to build more grid, more storage, more interconnectors, and that probably needs to be a European priority to get the interconnection in Europe moving, because we know Norway and Sweden connectors to Europe are a challenge now, and in every country this is a thing. But I think the interconnectedness of European markets are an absolute strength. They've helped us avoid shortages over the last 3 years, and we need to expand that because that will help build resilience.
Absolutely. On that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for being guests on the live Plugged In podcast from eWorld in Essen. So thank you, gentlemen, very much for a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
And to you listeners, thanks for listening to this episode of Plugged In. If you enjoyed this discussion, please like, rate, and follow to make sure you get the latest podcast episodes as soon as we release them every Thursday. We'd also love to read your reviews of the podcast. It helps us to keep up to date with what you, our listeners, think of the podcast and what content you want to receive more of. Finally, you can head to montelnews.com for more news and analysis from our team of journalists across Europe and beyond. See you next time.